Now, Holo, it's not showing on the YouTube. Now, Holo, if you can hear me, it's not showing on our regular thing.
You guys got to go back to the Kawaiaha Church TV page and
There I am.
during the 50th anniversary of the Jubilee celebration of the mission. She got up here right where I am and said, the narrative commenced with the touching story of Ōpūkahaʻia, the young Hawaiian who went to America to learn of true Christian.
Is our actual bicentennial date, but every third Sunday of the month at 4 p.m. we will be doing these presentations for you through the rest of the calendar year. So we encourage you to tune in via Kawaiaha Church TV on YouTube or Facebook Live so that you can tune in and have your knowledge expanded as we spend some time looking at the history of the church and the influences of what has made Kawaiaha Church and Christianity in these islands a very significant part of our lives. And so we are delighted today to welcome our wonderful speaker, Mr. Chris Cook. He is a longtime resident of Kauai in the Hanalei area. He is a board member on the Mission Houses trustee. He is also the former editor of the Garden Island newspaper and is an alumnus of the University of Hawaii Manoa. He is passionate about Henry Ōpūkahaʻia and has written perhaps one of the definitive works on the life of this important man. And we are excited to explore further today about this important historical character to our church and to Christianity in Hawaii. We know that Henry Ōpūkahaʻia was really the catalyst to inspire the mission to come to Hawaii and to bring the word of Christ to these islands. And so we are delighted. Chris Cook wrote a book in 2015, which he published, The Providential Life of and Heritage of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia. And so he will be speaking more about that in today's presentation. He is also publishing a new book called Preparing the Way, which will discuss further about the relationship between the Native Hawaiians and the American foreign mission movement and how they worked together to bring Christianity to Hawaii. And so we are really excited to welcome Chris Cook today, and we are looking forward to learning more about this important part of our Hawaiian history and our Hawaiian Christian history. So without further ado, we bring to the podium now Mr. Chris Cook.
Hey, mahalo, Aliyah. Nice introduction. So today we're going to take a new look at the memoirs of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia. Now, this classic book was published in 1818, and it's pretty much the seed for the beginning of Christianity in Hawaii. Okay. You get the next slide there. Okay, this is me back in 1983, and I was on a pilgrimage from my home in the North Shore of Kauai, and I ended up in the graveyard of Cornwall Center Cemetery and discovered the grave of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia. And I was inspired that day to search more into his life and to find out what the story was about Henry, about his compatriots, Native Hawaiians that attended the nearby foreign mission school. And that's the root of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay. I am close to the family of Ōpūkahaʻia, the Lee family, who returned his remains in 1993. This is Deborah Lee Kapeka Lee, and I met her when she led the return of Henry's remains from Cornwall to Kahikola Church in Napopo. And over the years, I've worked with the family and prayed with them and have their blessing to do the research I do on Ōpūkahaʻia. Now, the memoirs of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia, the original first edition of it, were reprinted in 1968 by the Women's Board of Missions for the Pacific Islands Hawaii Conference, and again reprinted in 2012. So if you want a copy of the original book, it's easily available at bookstores across Hawaii. In 2015, that's the year I released my book, The Providential Life and Heritage of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia, I was able to place a Sunday feature story in the Star Advertiser, and it was called In the Footsteps of Opukahaʻia. And this was my first-hand account of how I did research in New England and Hawaii and on the West Coast, and how I put the book together and wrote it. And you can find this online through the Star Advertiser. Okay, this is my book, The Providential Life and Heritage of Henry Ōpūkaha, which came out in 2015. And the book's available at the Mission Houses gift shop and at Logos Books in Honolulu. And that's some other look at Mokuaikawa Church in Hawaii Island and the Kauai Museum on Kauai. And this is my new book, Preparing the Way. And this is, it's a pictorial book, 160 pages in full color. It's hardbound, oversized, and it's sort of a photo version of my biography of Henry Ōpūkaha. And this is just being released. Okay, the Ōpūkaha is tied into the heritage of Kawaiaha Church. I'm very honored to be able to speak here today. I was just sitting out by the sparkling fountain, the Kawaiaha, that symbolic of what the place name of the church. And just thinking about the long heritage of Kawaiaha Church and how important it is in the history of Hawaii to this day. It's the mother church of Hawaii. Back in 1870, when only Lucy Thurston, the missionary wife who was in Kailua Kona the bulk of her life, came here to speak during the 50th anniversary of the Jubilee celebration of the mission, she got up here right where I am and said, the narrative commenced with the touching story of Ōpūkaha, the young Hawaiian who went to America to learn of true Christianity, that he might return and teach his countrymen. He and 3 or 4 other Hawaiians were taught in the mission school in Cornwall, Connecticut. It was their arrival and appeal to Christians in America that led those who embarked in the brig Thaddeus to devote themselves to missions. So what I've discovered about Ōpūkaha is that if you take his life out of the story of the missionaries, that you don't have a mission coming to Hawaii. If you take one little incident out of his life where he might have turned left or right, or possibly had been killed in a battle, the whole story of Hawaii would have changed, where the American missionaries wouldn't have come. Hawaii could have become part of Great Britain, could have been part of Russia maybe, or France, but because the missionaries came, we have the strong tie today to New England and America. So we're going to start the story. I'm sort of going to take you on a travelogue of the life and times of Henry Ōpūkaha. And we're going to start on Hawaii Island, Kamoko o Keawe, and this is where Henry spent the first part of his life. So we do a little counterclockwise trip around Hawaii Island. You begin at Ninole and Punalu'u in Ka'u on the southeast coast. And then you go up to Hilo, where his parents were killed in the battle, and up to Kahala, where the warriors who killed his family took him captive for a few years, and then down to the Hikiauheau in Kealakekua Bay at Napopo, where his uncle, Pahua, took him in to train him as a kahuna. Okay. This area is the birthplace of Henry Ōpūkaha, and this is Ninole. And most of you who've traveled Hawaii Island know the black sand beach of Punalu'u. So this is a stretch of beach that Henry grew up on. I'm sure he swam in the ocean. His father fished there. It's a fishing shrine on the right there, the walls, that ancient fishing shrine that his father probably brought a fish, the first catch of his, to honor the Hawaiian gods. In 1796, Ōpūkaha is about 10 years old, and a li'i named Namakea organizes an army and heads up to Hilo at the same time Kamehameha is conquering Oahu. The Kamehameha gets wind of it following the battle up here in Nuuanu and sends his warriors down to Kaipa'alaoa. That's right at the mouth of the Wailuka River in downtown Hilo, and there was a battle there. And Kamehameha's forces just rolled over the army from Ka'u, and his parents fled up into the hills outside of Hilo, and his parents were killed by the warriors. And Ōpūkaha ran away with his little brother, a famous story, and his brother was speared, but they spared his life because he was too young to create trouble, but old enough to be of service to them. So he was taken away to Kohala. After being rescued from Kohala by his uncle Pahua, who was a kahuna of Lono at the Hikiau Heiau, Ōpūkahaʻia was trained from about 1798 to 1808. About 10 years he was in training as a kahuna. And I recently discovered this, that the heiau, which was called Heli Heli Kalani, where he lived, was the same heiau where Captain Cook took part in the Lono ceremony back in 1779. And the ruins are still there. So in early 1808, Ōpūkahaʻia swam out to a New Haven ship named the Triumph in Kealakekua Bay. And he had been desiring to leave for quite a while, and finally he just felt something inside himself said, "This is your destiny," and he swam out to the Triumph to meet a captain named Caleb Britnell. So on the right is a spot at Ka'avaloa, and the X marks the spot is where Captain Cook was killed. So it's interesting that the life of Ōpūkahaʻia and James Cook intersect here at Kealakekua Bay, because both their legacies changed Hawaii forever. Okay, so in 1808, Ōpūkahaʻia and his younger friend Thomas Hopu took off on the Triumph. Henry was signed on as a sailor, and Hopu as a cabin boy. And they were about 7 or 8 years difference in age. Ōpūkahaʻia was about 20, Hopu about 13. And through analyzing ship logs, I discovered something that I don't believe has been published before. And it was thought that he went to Alaska or the Pacific Northwest with Captain Britnell where Britnell's men were hunting fur seals. But I discovered instead he actually went to an island off of Baja, Mexico called Guadalupe Island. So this desolate island was the first place outside of Hawaii that Ōpūkahaʻia landed at. Okay, aboard ship, the profile of this young Yale student named Russell Hubbard befriended Ōpūkahaʻia and began his training in English, and also began witnessing to him as a Christian. And through a news article sent to me to my website, Ōpūkahaʻia.com, I discovered that Ōpūkahaʻia's last stop in Hawaii, when he was heading out of Honolulu, heading for China with Captain Britnell to trade the fur seals skins they had captured for China goods, they actually stopped in Kauai, in Waimea, Kauai. And this is something brand new to the historical record. This is a painting of Whampoa Island. So Thomas Hopu and Ōpūkahaʻia would have spent 3 or 4 months on the Triumph, anchored here off Whampoa, while Captain Britnell was trading his furs for China goods. Now what's really interesting is that this actual painting, which is in a collection of Peter Britnell Cooper, a descendant of Britnell's family from New Haven, was aboard the Triumph when it sailed from China back to New York with Ōpūkahaʻia on board. Okay, so in 1809, towards the end of summer, Ōpūkahaʻia landed in New Haven, and here his life really changed. He could have returned to Hawaii on the next ship out, but instead he stayed, and this is why. So Ōpūkahaʻia was living with Captain Britnell and his wife right in the center of New Haven, just a few streets away from Yale. And he became very frustrated. He was a very intelligent young man, and he realized that the Yale students passing by carrying books knew the secret to reading these books to gather knowledge. And a man named Edwin DeWitt came up to him while he was weeping on the steps of Yale. And Edwin DeWitt invited him up to his dorm room at Connecticut Hall at Yale and began tutoring Ōpūkahaʻia. And what I've discovered, which is something new, this is a portrait of Edwin DeWitt, and the image came from the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. I discovered that Edwin grew up among the Mohican Indians in Stockbridge, which is in the the Berkshires and the far west of Massachusetts, which was a wilderness area in those days. So Edwin was, from childhood, had a familiarity with indigenous peoples. And this really, he was probably the best student at Yale to approach Ōpūkahaʻia. Now, another man named Samuel Mills showed up on the scene. And another little known fact about Edwin Dwight was that he was part of the Samuel Mills prayer group at Williams College. And in 1806, there was a famous haystack meeting on the lee side of a haystack. And in prayer, these students at Williams launched the foreign mission movement in America. Edwin wasn't there that day, but he was part of this group. So that was a big tie to the roots of foreign missions, which led in about 10 years to the mission to Hawaii. So at Connecticut Hall, the building in the back, is where Ōpūkahaʻia was being tutored by Edwin Dwight and other students. In the fall of 1809, Samuel Mills, who knew Edwin from Williams College, showed up in Edwin's room and met Ōpūkahaʻia and was very impressed by his intelligence, he was humorous, by his aloha, and he said, the light bulb went off in Samuel's mind, and he said, we should send a mission to Hawaii. He said, shall he be sent back and supported to attempt to reclaim his countrymen? Shall we not rather consider these southern islands a proper place for the establishment of a mission? So these words that he wrote in a letter to another missionary in training is the seed for the mission to Hawaii, and from that came Kawaiaha Church and the whole movement of Christianity in Hawaii. On the left is a visit by the family of Ōpūkahaʻia in 2017 to Yale University. They had a special day there, and that's Deborah Lee's in the center, and her cousins from Hawaii Island are alongside her. This was on the front page of the New Haven paper. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Henry's education in New England. So in late 1809, Samuel Mills had Henry released from the home of Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale. Now, I believe Ōpūkahaʻia was working there as a servant, and he had some problems, maybe with language or not being able to fulfill what they wanted him to do. So Samuel saw that it would be better for him to take him out into the country up in Litchfield County, Connecticut, where his family could take Ōpūkahaʻia in, and Ōpūkahaʻia had been orphaned since his family were killed back in the 1700s. So the Mills family offered him, for the rest of his life, they said, you have a home, you have support, aloha, we're going to hanai you, you're part of our family from now on. So at first he was tutored at the Mills home in Torrey Ford, Connecticut, which is up in the northwest corner of Connecticut, and taught catechism, basic Bible studies, basic reading and writing. Then 1811 he went to Andover, which is a town 20 miles north of Boston, where today is the Phillips Academy at Andover is located. And students there, theology students at Andover, chipped in, and they paid for the tuition of Ōpūkahaʻia at a place called Bradford Academy. And this was an elementary school, and Henry was about age 23. It wasn't unusual in those days for somebody older to come back to school, so it wasn't that strange. From there, he was tutored at Andover and worked in the summertime in fields, felling trees, and had a life there. And 1813, he came back to Torrey Ford, which would be all the ways across Massachusetts up to the northwest corner of Connecticut, and was sent to a place called the Morris Academy. And that would be about maybe a middle school education he required there. After that, he came back to Torrey Ford and was sent to live with various pastors. And he was taught one-on-one. He advanced to about high school level education then, but he was also being trained in biblical language. This is where he began to learn some Hebrew. 1816, a school called the Heathen School, it's not sort of a disparaging name, but that was a common word in those days for non-Christians. Was started in a parsonage adjacent to the Morris Academy, about 10 miles south of the town of Litchfield. And to here was Thomas Hopu, who had been at sea in the West Indies, came back, joined him, William Kanui from Kauai, and and another Native Hawaiian student made up the 4 students that attended school here. Okay, this is a written, published report about his education as of 1816. And he had been studying English grammar, learned arithmetic, learned how to figure interests, was studying Euclid's elements of geometry. And what's really interesting, it says, by his own exertions, without any regular instructor, he's acquired considerable knowledge of the Hebrew language. Okay, and he had read several chapters. He read Genesis and translated portions of Genesis into the Hawaiian language. And this is the very beginning of the creation of the Hawaiian Bible. And he really felt that. Ōpūkaha later wrote that the Hebrew language very much reminded him of the feel and the spirit of the Hawaiian language, much more so than English does. Now, Ōpūkaha at first didn't understand Christianity, and he sort of, I'd say he played along for a while because that was, his support was coming from Christians who just happened to be involved at the very heart of foreign missions in America. So his Christian pilgrimage began in 1809. He was attending church services in New Haven. And then 1810, he was taught the Westminster Catechism by the Mills family. He began to pray at Andover in 1811 and did some Bible study. 1814, he was baptized at the Torringford Church by Samuel Mills' father, Reverend Samuel Mills. And from 1814 to 1816, he became an avid Christian, evangelizing, speaking to the public, walking down highways, talking to people, and he kept a little New Testament in the pocket of his jacket and would pull that out. And he would challenge Christians in New Haven why they weren't committed as Christians. He also challenged Edwin Dwight at this period to come to Hawaii as a missionary. But his Christian conversion happened in this beautiful rural town named Hollis, New Hampshire. And this is just north of the Massachusetts border. We went on a tour there last October during the bicentennial of the departure of the Pioneer Mission Company to Hawaii from Boston. And I led a tour through Hollis. And at this home of the Reverend Eli Smith, a beautiful home that's still there, Ōpūkaha was on his deathbed, and the pastor there and one of the deacons and their families nursed him back to health. And during this close call with death, he called out to God and came close to Christ and became a committed Christian after this out of Hollis. From 1816 to 18, Ōpūkaha went up to Litchfield County, Connecticut, and this is up in the northwest corner. And it was an area at that time called a Field of Divine Wonders. Now this is really amazing that Litchfield had the most churches in revival, the most support for foreign missions, and again, his providential life, he ended up in probably the hottest spot for the Second Great Awakening, which was a big movement in New England that began in 1800 in New Haven and resulted in the sending of foreign missions, of prison reform, women's rights, anti-slavery movement, temperance, anti-alcohol, Bible Society, more help for the inner city missions in New York City, missions of sailors, you name it, the Second Great Awakening got it going. And a lot of these issues played out in the news today of America. So this is, you can see the red hashtag line there. That's where Litchfield County is located. Now, a minister who became pretty prominent in New England named Edward Dorr Griffin was pastor of a church in a little town called New Hartford, and it was just down the highway from Torringford where Ōpūkaha was. And he said that he could look out and imagine the churches of Litchfield and surrounding counties and see a field of divine wonders. There was over 60 churches that were having revivals. In other words, dozens and dozens and dozens of new members were joining the churches. There was an avid interest in foreign missions. People were donating per capita more than anywhere else in New England out of Litchfield. And it was really if you want to see a snapshot of what the excitement in America of the Second Great Awakening, this was the place. Now also there was missionary magazines, monthlies, one called the Missionary Herald, and these were among the most popular magazines in New England at the time. So Americans had gone out on foreign missions to Burma, to Ceylon, and the American readers followed the stories of these young Americans that laid down their life to go on a mission. They avidly followed them, and they became sort of celebrities. The accounts also appeared in secular newspapers. Now this is an important little church. The photo on the left is of the tour that I served as the interpretive guide on. It was called the Hanaho New England Tour. And this was the last week in October of 2019. And this is some kahu and other folks from Kauai to Hawaii Island that went on this a bus tour from right across New England. And we held a service inside the South Canaan Church in Litchfield County. Now this is the only church still standing where Ōpūkahaʻia actually went in and attended services. All the other buildings of the churches, the sanctuaries, have been torn down or burnt down since his lifetime. So this is the last church where you can go in and say this is where Ōpūkahaʻia actually sat in these pews. And what's important there was that Ōpūkahaʻia, he rapidly accelerated in his learning, and he was at the level of a college student, maybe even a graduate student in biblical studies at this point. He picked up Hebrew, knew some Greek, knew some Latin, and was avidly reading the Bible and studying it. And the minister who lived across the street from this church, Reverend Charles Prentice, encouraged him to keep a spiritual journal and also write a history of his life. So Prentice's advice had Henry do these things, and when it came time to compile the Memoirs of Henry Ōpūkaha, these two pieces were very important parts of the book. This is a first edition copy of the book right here I have, and the words that he wrote here at South Canaan are inside the book here, okay? So the summer of 1817, a brand new school called the Foreign Mission School opened in Cornwall, Connecticut. And this was something became very celebrated in New England. This is the actual building decades later after Ōpūkahaʻia and Hopu and other Native Hawaiians studied here. Now I believe Ōpūkahaʻia lived in the second story of this building. He was a star pupil. The people of Cornwall donated the building and land. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was established in 1810, funded the school and oversaw it. And a number of Native Hawaiians joined Henry there, including Humehumi, George Prince, the son of Kamali'i, the king of Kauai. Now the building in the back here is the Commons, and this building still stands. And this is the ladies from Kawaiaha Church with the golden scarves there. They were on the tour with us, and they were in New England for the Bicentennial events happening in October of 2019 at Boston. And the man on the left is Ben Silliman Gray. His ancestor was the pioneer in teaching chemistry at Yale, and he's the owner of the home right now. So in this building, that's where the Ōpūkahaʻia, Hopu, and the other Native Hawaiian students, they did their laundry, they came and sat around the fire, they socialized. Some of them lived here. It's where they had their meals. And Cornwall's a very small little village, and it's easy to walk from where the Foreign Mission School was to the Commons, and the graveyard where Ōpūkahaʻia is buried is just a short walk from the downtown too. Now, what was important about the school is it was, I believe, the first school in the world that the idea was to take indigenous people that were found in a place, found in New England, and train them to become missionaries to return back to evangelize their home countries after being sent back. Now, Ōpūkaha, he did some speaking away from Cornwall. This is in February 1817. And the American Board of Commissioners, which was formed at the request of Samuel Mills and other students at Andover in 1810, what they did when they identify somebody who might become a foreign missionary, they would send them out to speak in churches and to raise their support, to raise money for the foreign missions movement. And this was sort of a trial to see how serious they were about going on a mission. So this is a Sunday night in February, and a large crowd gathers at a small town in Massachusetts, not too far from Williams, where the haystack meeting was, up in the northwest corner of Massachusetts. So this is a newspaper report. So an agent who, for the American Board of Commissioners, who had recruited Ōpūkaha back in Cornwall, brought him to Amherst, Massachusetts, and the agent, whose name was Mr. Prentice, gave a sermon about the importance of sending the gospel around the world. Now this is during the Second Great Awakening, so the two things that were going on then was the idea of sending foreign missions to around the world in hopes of the coming of a millennium with the return of Christ to the earth. And the other part was to work out, to send missionaries to Israel. And a second mission, when the Hawaii mission left, a second mission went to, two missionaries went to Jerusalem at the same time. That's another story. So Prentice would sort of work the congregation and tell the story about Ōpūkaha, they called him Henry Ōpūkaha in New England. That was his Yankee name. And then it would build up to him coming up in the pulpit, and he was considered a heathen, somebody that didn't come from a culture that was Christian. They believed in a multitude of gods, and he was from what they called the South Seas, which would be the Pacific Islands. And then Ōpūkaha, in pretty good English, would read from Genesis, and then read from Genesis in Hawaiian language. And then afterwards, he would be at the back of the church and hand out tracts and shake hands, and people would make donations to foreign missions. So I have a little, one of the tracts, this is from the same run of the tracts that Ōpūkaha handed out, and this one's called Conversation in a Boat Between Two Seamen. And of course, he had spent a year at sea as a sailor, so he knew about sailors, about their lives. And they didn't lead the most moral life, so it was a good subject for him to talk about. Okay. Now, another thing Ōpūkaha did, which really helped when they put the memoirs together, was he wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of letters. He loved to correspond with people. It would be, I guess you'd call them his pen pals, and he had pen pals all over New England. And this particular letter is in a collection at Sterling Library in Yale. And it's a response to a man that he met when he got up and read Genesis in Greenfield, Massachusetts. See, it's addressed to Greenfield. And his name was Colonel Samuel Wells, Jr. And he was a prominent citizen of Greenfield. And you can see the beautiful cursive handwriting Ōpūkaha possessed. And I like to address this because there's some doubts about his life back in New England. So all these anecdotes I bring up are trying to show that, yes, he was a real person. He did have a really deep experience, and these events really did happen. It's not just a story that was made up to promote missions. And this is some of the inside text of the letter. And Ōpūkaha notes in this letter of the arrival in Cornwall of a young future missionary to Hawaii named James Ely. And Ely was 17 when he came to the Foreign Mission School, and he entered in June, the same time that the school started up. And he spent 1817 to 1822 living with first of Ōpūkaha and Hopu, and later of other native Hawaiians at the Foreign Mission School. And we believe that he learned some Hawaiian language. Now, another interesting thing that I've been back to New England maybe a half dozen times doing pretty intensive research. As I said in my article I wrote in the Star Advertiser, I followed in the footsteps of Ōpūkahaʻia. So I made a list of every town, every church, every school that he attended where he went, and I went there in person, and I went to the archives. I walked around where he walked, and I really began getting a feel for his life. But the one thing I didn't expect was that I discovered that Ōpūkahaʻia played a big role in the lives of people that were influential decades later in the anti-slavery movement. Now, this home on that you see here is the home of Lyman Beecher. And he was the pastor in Litchfield, which is the county seat in Litchfield County. And his daughter was Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom. Abraham Lincoln called her the little lady that started the Civil War. So Uncle Tom, even though the book sort of is disparaged today, it did draw a lot of support for ending slavery in America. Now, her younger brother was named Henry Ward Beecher, and he was probably the most famous American preacher of the last half of the 19th century. So when Henry was nearing Henry Beecher, that is, was nearing the end of his life, he had a big church in Brooklyn, New York called the Plymouth Church. He gave a talk summing up his life, and he said, I am what I am because Henry Ōpūkaha from the Sandwich Islands was taught at the Cornwall School in Connecticut, and in my boyhood came down to my father's house and produced an impression on me which has undulated and propagated and gone on influencing me. So Henry Ward Beecher also played a role in the anti-slavery movement, and I've discovered a number of other connections. Joshua Coffin, who was part of Harrison's anti-slavery newspaper. He crossed paths with John Brown, the abolitionist. And more than that, he was a person of color that spoke in churches, was very educated, very well spoken, and his aloha spirit, it sort of changed things in New England too when he went around, and that was really noted. He was really a kind-hearted Christian. He emanated the best of the Native Hawaiian culture and the best of a Christian culture. Now, Kawaiaha, I've discovered that had a tie to Martin Luther King through the Reverend Abraham Akaka, who was the kahu of the Kawaiaha Church back in the 1960s when the Civil Rights Movement, when Martin Luther King led the Civil Rights Movement. So you can sort of see how Henry's role in this, eventually came through the Kawaiaha Church and continued on into the 20th century. So unfortunately, on mid-February 1818, after about a month of being ill, Ōpūkahaʻia died of what's called typhus fever. And that comes from a disease brought through rats, the fleas come off of rats and they get onto horses and dogs and come onto humans. And there was no antibiotics in those days, so he contracted that and struggled and died in Cornwall. Now there's quite a record of his death because many people, Samuel Mill's father, Hopu, and many other figures from Cornwall, the Foreign Mission School, were at his deathbed. And so he was, this is about a half mile from where the school was. And when you go to the Cornwall Cemetery, it's the only grave that's raised like this. It's like the people really loved him in Cornwall, and really went out of their way to make to create a beautiful, a memorable gravesite for him. Now again, as I said, Deborah Lee and her family were able in 1993 to disinter the remains of Ōpūkahaʻia, and they were returned to Hawaii, back to Kahikolo Church at Kealakekua Bay, where he left to come to New England from. And over the years, this has been a pilgrimage site. Groups from Kawaiaha Church have come here, and churches, the Kalawina churches across Hawaii, the Native Hawaiian churches have come here. So this is how the book, the Memoirs of Ōpūkahaʻia, came about. And we can look at this. Yeah, this is the first edition here. I'll show you. And it was published in New Haven, and this was sold as a fundraiser for the Foreign Mission School. So the obituary for Ōpūkahaʻia, he died in the mid-February, and things sort of moved slow from the country then. It finally appeared in March in the major newspaper in Connecticut, the Hartford Courant, and I found a copy of that at the American Antiquarian Society. And in his obituary, at the end of it, Edwin Dwight left a note. Edwin had become the principal of the Foreign Mission School, so he came back into the life of Ōpūkahaʻia at Cornwall. And he asked people that had any, interesting letters Ōpūkahaʻia had written or any facts in his life they wanted to talk about to contact him at the Foreign Mission School in Cornwall. So then Edwin went into Ōpūkahaʻia's room and gathered his papers, his spiritual journal, his personal history, his letters, notes he had. And then by August of 1818, and again, Ōpūkahaʻia died in February of 1818, he had put together the book, this little book, The Memoirs of Henry Ōpūkaha, and it was ready for press. He put a notice out to the churches. He was selling the books at subscription for 75 cents a copy. So this book was originally 75 cents a copy. And had sold some of the books in advance so we'd have enough money to pay for the first printing. And the book came out right around Thanksgiving, early December 1818. And this is an ad for the book out of Boston. And so it was The Memoirs of Henry Ōpūkaha, a native of Hawaii. That's an old Yankee spelling of Hawaii. And a member of the Foreign Mission School, about his death. And it included a funeral sermon and a piece about the Foreign Mission School. And again, it included a portrait of Ōpūkahaʻia. It said a likeness of Mr. Ōpūkaha. So they were selling them in Boston for 50 cents. So I guess there was different prices. Now I've investigated who the artist was, and it was said that it was Samuel F.B. Morris, the inventor of the telegraph, who was a portrait artist in those days. But I contacted the leading expert in the art of Samuel F.B. Morris, and he really didn't know for sure if it was his drawing or not. I don't believe he actually did it. So this could be an imaginative drawing. Maybe it isn't Ōpūkahaʻia, because it was cut into a metal plate after his death. So it's a big question if this is really Ōpūkahaʻia or not. So the book went on, it was released in New Haven, and first couple of printings of 2000 sold out, became a bestseller. Was reprinted several other places in New Jersey, again in Boston, and later it was taken up by the American Tract Society. And over time, about 50,000 copies were sold, and newspapers also took sections of the book, and his story was in secular newspapers, and he sort of became an American folk hero. The famous author Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, read of Ōpūkaha and read the Memoirs of Ōpūkaha in a Sunday school class. Later on, when he came to Hawaii, one of the things at the top of his list was to visit the Hikiau Heiau, where Ōpūkaha had served. Twain went there, wrote about it, and sort of put him into more, again, he had another rise in popular fiction, popular notice in America. So, but what the book really did, though, was it inspired as we heard Lucy Thurston say earlier. Oh, you can move forward. It's okay. Lucy Thurston at the beginning of the slideshow in 1870, from right here, explained to the congregation gathered to hear from a pioneer missionary what the motive was for the missionaries to come here to Hawaii. And the driving force, their gut feeling why they came was they were inspired by the story of Henry Ōpūkaha, a native of Hawaii. At the wedding of Hiram and Sybil Bingham, Hiram designed the Kawaiaha church, didn't build it. He left Hawaii before it was built. At their wedding, which was, they were married in the middle of a Sunday service at the Brick Church in Hartford. Thomas Gallaudet, who was the pioneer of deaf education in America, he said, from thousands of hearts will intercessions for you ascend daily to the throne of grace, speaking to the Binghams who are heading out to Hawaii. Be faithful unto death, and may the mantle of Ōpūkaha descend rest upon you. Farewell. So the Thaddeus left in October 23rd, 1819 from Boston. And on board the Thaddeus were a number of these little books, these little memoirs of Ōpūkaha. They went around the Horn and were brought to Hawaii. So at the very beginning of Kawaiaha Church, on the grounds right around here, the first Sunday school class was held in a thatched building in Honolulu in 1820. And Sybil Bingham, the lady there on the left, Hiram Bingham's wife, led the Sunday school class. And she took this same little book, started reading out of it from the Memoirs of Henry Ōpūkaha in English. And Thomas Hopu, Ōpūkaha's shipmate on the Triumph, his fellow student at Cornwall, gave the Hawaiian language version of the story. So nobody in Hawaii knew who Henry Ōpūkaha was when the missionaries arrived. So this story was brand new. So the students in the Sunday school, who would have been, young people and old people, and upon hearing the story, Sybil wrote that they broke into tears about hearing the tragedies that Ōpūkaha faced in bringing the Bible and Christianity to his people. Now, at the end of his life, he just pled with the fellow native Hawaiian students to carry on for him and bring the gospel here to Hawaii. Ōpūkaha requested the missionaries to come here. The missionaries didn't come on their own volition. The native Hawaiian, Henry Ōpūkaha, invited the missionaries to come to Hawaii, and they followed through. So no one in Honolulu had heard of the life of Ōpūkaha prior to Sybil opening her little leather-bound copy of the Memoirs. So 1824, the second missionary company had left New Haven in 1822 as reinforcements to Hiram Bingham and the other missionaries that came here in 1820. And one of the teachers aboard the second company from New Haven was James Ely, the 17-year-old who Ōpūkaha wrote about in his letter to Greenfield, Massachusetts. And Ely was stationed at Ka'awaloa. Now that's the village where Captain Cook was killed in 1779. It's on Kealikakua Bay, and it's about a mile or so across the bay from Hikiau, where Ōpūkaha lived. And so Ely wrote this in a report back to Boston, and when he arrived at Ka'awaloa. And when I cast my eyes across the bay and saw the foundation of the heathen temple where Ōpūkaha worshipped, that's Hikiau, I thought of our former prayers and vows and hopes. I thought of his last prayer for his countrymen, which he breathed forth in his dying hour. So Ely was a student at the Foreign Mission School. It was likely he was there at the deathbed of Ōpūkaha, and this confirms that till the very end, Ōpūkaha was encouraging the missionaries and his native Hawaiian scholars that he had studied with to bring the gospel to Hawaii. That was one of his last hopes for that to happen. So as the memoirs grew in popularity, it inspired many missionaries not just to come to Hawaii. The missionaries that went out to Oregon from the American Board that sort of founded the American stronghold in the Oregon Territory had been inspired by reading the memoirs of Ōpūkaha. And the book was translated into other languages, into the Choctaw Indian language, into Greek, into Dutch. But this copy, which I was able to pick up on the internet out of a bookstore in Spain, this is very rare. It's the only copy I've ever been able to locate, or even in libraries. It's a French version of the life of Samuel Mills, and there's an appendix in the back that's a condensation of the memoirs of Henry Ōpūkaha, and this is in French. So what's really interesting is that the Native Hawaiian churches are called the Kalawina churches after John Calvin, Calvinism. And this booklet, which is looks about this size, was printed in Geneva, Switzerland, and that's the home of John Calvin. So it sort of came full circle. The story of Ōpūkaha was printed in the home of Calvin, who's the source of Calvinism, and the theology of the churches that were first organized in Hawaii, and which today we know from the name Kalawina of the organization of the Calvinist congregational churches, Native Hawaiian churches in Hawaii. Now, in about 1865, when Hawaiian language newspapers really started spreading across Hawaii, now, the benefits that the American missionaries brought are numerous, and probably the most prominent was the coming of literacy, be able to read and write in the Hawaiian language. Hawaii became the most literate, or one of the most literate nations in the world. Supposedly 90% of the people could read or write within a generation of the missionaries coming. And starting about the 1830s, Hawaiian language writers started writing in newspapers, beginning at Lahaina, students at Lahaina Luna, and by the 1860s, there were full-scale Native Hawaiian language newspapers. So the kahu of the Kahikola Church, which is right above the Hikiau-Heiau in Kealakekua Bay, decided to write a Hawaiian language version of the Memoirs. So he took the Memoirs and translated it in Native Hawaiian language. But he was pretty wise, because he put it in a Native Hawaiian, he serialized it in a Native Hawaiian newspaper, and then asked readers to comment on his translation of the Memoirs if there was any new information they could add or any corrections. So Ōpūkahaʻia's family, some who had been alive when he was being trained as a kahuna at Hikiau, gave the kahu a new birth date. It was 1787 instead of an earlier date of 1792, and more information about his mother and father and about the battle and so forth. And so the text for this in the Native Hawaiian language was sent back to New York. The American Tract Society published it, and the book was released in Hawaii in 1876. This is a copy of it in the Native Hawaiian language, and this is a portrait of Henry Ōpūkaha. And again, this is an idealized portrait of him. Now, during World War II, an interesting Hawaiian scholar named Charles Ken, who was an expert in Lua, the Hawaiian martial arts, in the 1920s, he started working on a biography of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia, had the same inspiration I did. And in the 1940s, in the magazine Paradise of Pacific, he translated back the Native Hawaiian version of the Memoirs into English. And this was serialized in the late 1944-45, towards the tail end of the World War II. So you can go into the Paradise of the Pacific in the archives and read what the words and what he wrote about him in the Native Hawaiian language, which is a little bit different than this translation. So just to sum up, this little book, it's amazing, because the history of Hawaii, it sort of balances on top of this little book. This church was formed because of the impact of this little book. Kawaiaha was formed because of the impact of this little book. The American missionaries came to Hawaii because of this little book. The way of life we have today, all the pillars of society in Hawaii, education, law, medicine, music, especially music. The Ōpūkahaʻia loved to hear the hymns in New England, and later on when the missionaries came, the hymns were written in the Hawaiian language. So very, very critical book, and it's often overlooked, and I hope that in my writing that I've told the true story of Henry Ōpūkahaʻia, and I hope it's an inspiration for the youth of Hawaii. Well, thank you very much. I hope some of the items I brought up today, the new things, interest you, and aloha, and aloha keakua.
Well, thank you, Chris. And again, this is a portion where I think if you were in the audience, you'd be clapping.
Thanks,
but our virtual audience, so thank you, everyone. At this time, We are going to switch over to our virtual format. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask of Chris, you have to do it in the chat room, and then from the chat, we'll be asking that to Chris virtually. And just in the unlikely event that there is a glitch, we want to apologize in advance. But once again, we'd like to thank you for attending today. This will be rebroadcast next week, Sunday at 12 noon. And you can just, again, check our Kawaiaha website. But again, we'd like to invite you to come every third Sunday at 4 p.m. Just to continue celebrating Christianity coming to Hawaii and to Kawaiaha Church for the past 200 years. So at this time, we'll be switching it over to our virtual format, and we'd like to thank you very much. And again, thank you to Chris for
You guys can start your video, please. Hey, Chris, how's your video?
Hey.
Let's see. I just sent you a request to start your video.
There we go. Okay. How's that? Look okay?
It's good.
Okay, let me get this thing turned around. Hang on a second there.
Everyone.
Oh, that's better. Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Sounds good.
Okay. Hey there. Hello. Aloha.
Aloha, Chris.
Hi. You guys are having some trouble there with the coronavirus, huh?
That
That's
was an
right.
excellent presentation, Chris.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad.
So
And,
if I may I start the questions?
sure.
Okay, so I found it very interesting that Henry Ōpūkahaʻia would pick up a second language, English language, and then be quite proficient in it, and to be able to go on to a third language, the Hebrew language. And I think
Right.
you alluded to the fact that he started to translate. So in your research, to what extent did you do the translation? Did you see any parts of what he might have done?
No, there's really no record exactly of how he translated it. I was hoping that when they had Genesis translated by the missionaries, they might add some record of it, but I think they started from scratch. But they did have a copy of the book of Genesis, I think in Hawaiian, aboard the Thaddeus. They made like a study book up, one of a kind book, and it might have been in there. And I don't know where that book went to. But you want a little bit of the background, how he picked it up was really, I mean, he used his Hawaiian ingenuity. I mean, this guy was really sharp and saw the world maybe a different way than the Yankees did in New England. But he used the study notes, I believe, from a course at the Andover Theological Seminary, and met with a student that he knew from his days at Yale. He came down from probably Litchfield and visited the student in New Haven, and he was tutored in the basics in Hebrew, took the class notes, and pretty much was self-taught. And on top of that, he created an alphabet for the Hawaiian language, basic grammar, and began just went for it and translated it into right from Hebrew into the Hawaiian language. Now, on top of that, he noticed how the similarities between the sort of the mindset of the Hebrew language and how much it was like the Hawaiian language, and where the English language is maybe more straightforward, more fact-based, where the Hebrew and Hawaiian language is much more, I'd say, spiritual might be the word used, more deep spiritually than that what you pick up when you speak the English language. Really interesting. Back in the late 1940s, a Jewish organization named him as a honorable scholar of the Hebrew language. He was posthumously honored by a Jewish organization and officially termed as a Hebrew scholar. So that's pretty cool, huh?
Wow.
Thank you.
Chris, I have a question. This is Haunani. We
Hey,
always,
now, Nani.
hi, and for people who don't know, Chris lives on Kauai. So thank you again, Chris. Now, one of the things we always hear about is like, oh, poor Henry, they found him weeping on the steps of Yale, and that's, people took pity on him and put him in his. Now, is that a fact or is that a myth? That, that he really was mentored by those people, or is that just, it makes for good storytelling, but is that a fact or not a fact?
No, I believe it's a fact because there's several sources for that. Edwin Dwight, Samuel Mills, and I think there's some other accounts too. I've been around Yale. It was a much smaller campus in those days, and just a minor question was, where exactly were the steps? It might have been right at Connecticut Hall, the dorm where they brought him into. But Samuel Mills, has a lengthy letter that he wrote to a missionary in training named James Richards, and James eventually headed to India and died in India as a missionary. And he details, sessions with Henry up in Connecticut Hall. And then also Edwin Dwight wrote extensively too about their meetings up in Connecticut Hall. James Richards, I believe he was the brother of William Richards, who came to Hawaii, a missionary to Hawaii. So you can see this was a small circle of people, mostly Yale-trained ministers. And so it's amazing, one of the most amazing stories of the many amazing stories about Hawaii is Henry and his buddies over in his little ohana that he created back in Connecticut. Really great story. Yeah.
It is a great story. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions?
Hey, Kahu.
Hi. So
Hey, didn't I see you in Boston one time? Yeah. Hi.
Funny, it seems like I saw you there in October.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. I had the same little book too, didn't I?
Well, who was the first one to ask the board of the ABCFM to send missionaries to Hawaii?
Okay. So the ideas began with Samuel Mills. He was the missionaries had a secret society called the Brethren. This is little known about, and almost all the men that were ordained missionaries that came to Hawaii were members of the Brethren, and they wrote letters back to the Brethren and so forth. So Samuel Mills graduated from Williams and then headed down to Yale, sort of covertly, to recruit students to go on foreign missions. So that's how he ended up in Edwin Dwight's room. And I'm sort of beating around the bush a little bit here, but so after meeting Henry in Ōpūkahaʻia and Samuel Mills' dorm room, he light bulb went off in his head, and he said, "Oh yeah, we have to send a mission to Hawaii they're called the Sandwich Islands, from Captain Cook's days." And they wrote a letter to James Richards. So that was sort of the planted the seed. And then gradually it developed. And Ōpūkahaʻia, he would speak and say, he wanted the gospel sent to Hawaii, and he wanted to be a missionary. He wanted to co-lead the mission. He lived in Goshen, Connecticut, which is in Litchfield. It's about 4 or 5 miles from Cornwall, with a pastor named Joseph Harvey, the Reverend Joseph Harvey. And now Litchfield was like I said in my talk, it was called the Field of Divine Wonders. And it was the hot spot in all of New England. That's another amazing thing, that of all the places where the Foreign Mission School would be, it would be the hot spot in all of the Second Great Awakening. So Harvey, Ōpūkahaʻia, Hopu, and maybe George Kamuali'i lived with Joseph Harvey, 1815, part of 1816. They lived in this home in the parsonage, and he was tutored in biblical language one-on-one. And because Litchfield gave the per capita the highest amount for foreign missions of any town, any area in New England, it became pretty prominent with the American board. They had a big connection there. So Harvey actually drafted a letter around 1817, and it was sort of beginning of a bureaucratic process. And he formally requested that a mission be sent to the Sandwich Islands. Now, the American Board of Commissioners, they had chapters in all the churches in New England. So this was from the Litchfield Missionary Society to the American Board of Commissioners, asking for a foreign mission to be sent to Hawaii. And at that time, the concept was that Samuel Mills and Henry Ōpūkahaʻia would be the leaders of the mission to Hawaii. And then Samuel Mills was involved in many Christian works. And the last one was to go to Africa and set up a colony for freed slaves. And he surveyed that. It was called, became the nation of Liberia. And on the way back to London aboard ship, he died off the coast of Africa, right off, sort of off Morocco, was buried at sea. And that happened about 3-4 months after Ōpūkahaʻia died. So, the mustard seed parable. So those two passed away, but their legacy resulted in the mission to Hawaii. So it started with a letter written in a parsonage in Little Goshen. Now, Peter Young and I went to and other people from the mission houses went to Goshen in September last year, and we had a service there to mark the ordination of Bingham and Thurston as the ordained missionaries to Hawaii. And that's why they were ordained to Goshen, because the letter came out of Goshen, and that's why the mission to Sandwich Islands started. So that's why they were ordained there. Sorry, a little bit long, but that explain it a little bit.
No, that was wonderful. Another question would be, do you know of any documents that exist of sermons by Henry? I mean, you said that these special people that they tagged, I forgot the word, but to go out and start to preach as practicing missionaries, maybe there would be some documents in these various churches.
Yeah, those I keep on finding more letters that he wrote. So hopefully in one of the letters, but he was when he appeared in the churches, he was how can I explain this? He went with an American board agent. So it was usually a minister would be given a region to raise funds for foreign missions. And then Henry would go out. I believe who was the other one that went out? I think it was Kanui went out too, and even Hume went out on speaking tours. So I'm trying to find information about that. They were taken by American board agents into churches across New England. But the place where Ōpūkahaʻia focused on was Amherst, Massachusetts, and so there's reports in some of the newspapers there. I want to go to this one town in Massachusetts and look more into their newspapers to see if they have any more accounts. Now, what's interesting is who lived in Amherst was Noah Webster, the Webster's dictionaries. And when Ōpūkahaʻia started his grammar, he put these little numbers. Al Schultz, he's a professor at University of Hawaii Manoa. He wrote a book about the Hawaiian language. I think it's Voices of Eden, and he explains how Ōpūkahaʻia used some of Webster's little numbers to replace vowels in his. So I believe that Ōpūkahaʻia and Webster crossed paths. So I need to go to Amherst and do some digging there. And the more I travel around New England, like I think I told you in Boston, the more amazing things turn up. So I even found a incredible amount of I found Native Hawaiian letters at the Norman Rockwell Museum of all places in Stockbridge. And I share those with Puakea and friends at the UH Hawaiian Studies too. So Ōpūkahaʻia was usually he was sort of like the highlight of the appearance at a church, and the American board agent would make a plea for missions and tell the story about Ōpūkahaʻia, and then he would get up there and it was like, wow, here's a Hawaiian in our church, in central Massachusetts. Today even that would be pretty incredible, but in those days it was like totally, really, really, something amazing to see that in a New England church. And then he would tell a bit about his story, and then read from his handwritten papers, and read the book of Genesis in the Hawaiian language. And then I have some of the not the exact tracts he handed out, but the same printing out of Hartford. And he would be at the back of the church and hand out tracts and, speak to the people at the back of the church, just like a guest speaker at your church might do today.
I love the stories of Henry, but I feel like Ōpūkaha, those were not exemplified also, because they're the ones who returned, that helped spread the gospel, helped open the path for the missionaries to get
right
with the li'i and the mo'i. And I'm wondering how that can be even more exemplified than it has. Well, it has.
Yeah. So my new book, Preparing the Way, the oversized hardback I just put out. If you look in the second section of that, it's okay. So I told the story of how the American missionaries and the Native Hawaiians scholars like Ōpūkahaʻia and Hopu, and a Tahitian Christian named Auna that came to Hawaii in 1822 with the London Missionary Society. So the main part of the narrative in my new book, the first one tells the story of Opukahaʻia up to his death. And then the second section it moves to Hopu. So the whole second section of my book is told through the life of Hopu, and what happened to him in New England, and when he came back, what happened. And the third section is told through the life of Auna in Hawaii. So Hopu, he had a pretty amazing time. There is a Memoirs of Thomas Hopu. It's a short paper that I found at the Andover Newton Theological Seminary. And if you get into the details of his life, he went back to sea and was going to the West Indies, and God saved his life a number of times in the West Indies. He was in a bad shipwreck. He was in prison there, and he saw slavery firsthand there too. The sugar plantations in the West Indies. He knew what slavery was. But just one little anecdote. So his last voyage to the West Indies, when he came back, he was with, he had some pretty wild times, aboard ship. So they went to these islands that were somewhere near Nantucket. And this is during the War of 1812. And the British had taken an American merchant ship. And it was sort of like a pirate's cove. And the British were, hiding the ship. And Hopu and his buddies sailed in and recaptured the ship from the British. I think blew up part of the Pirates Cove, and then sailed back to Boston, and he got off the ship. So that story is little known. He had some, really major adventures. And then he ended up in New York State, and he came down, decided he wanted to go back to Hawaii, and he rode on Fulton's steamboat, down the Hudson River with Robert Fulton, came into New York and asked about Captain Brittenell, went back to New Haven, was going to head back to Hawaii. And then his friends in New Haven, they loved him too as much as Henry, And he lived with a doctor who had a drugstore in New Haven, Dr. Hotchkiss. And they said, Thomas, we can send you for an education. There's going to be this new school, and they sent him up, and he became educated. And he became, very, I guess I don't know if the word sophisticated, or he knew how to handle himself very well in the Western world, because he was, isolated quite a bit too. Another story, he was taken to New Jersey with one of the men from Cornwall, one of the, I think a deacon, and it's sort of a lawyer went to a dinner party, and the lawyer was being very condescending to him, and Thomas spoke back to him and said, "What kind of Christian are you?" And what would God say if you heard you talking to me like this? And it just broke the guy. And the guy got down on his knees and it changed his whole life. Thomas changed his whole life. So there's stories out there like that, and in journals, and I'm finding more and more about Thomas. So good stories. And another guy named George Sandwich. Do you mind if I go on just a little bit, or this? So I'm at the American Antiquarian Society in Boston. I'm looking for something in the newspaper. This is where you always find the best stuff, where you don't expect it. So I see this little notice, 1805, right? Run away, run away, Sandwich Islander, right? So we came in on a ship from Kauai, 1805, and I guess he didn't understand what was going on, but the shipmaster told him that you have to work out your passage when you get back here. So they put this ad in the paper, and it's like a slave ad. You know, they describe him like a, you know, is how size and what clothes he was wearing, and said turn him in for reward. You know, so George was smart, and he took off and went to Central Massachusetts and worked on a farm for 10 years, and then ended up at Cornwall. And he came back in 1821, but he came alone. He was so trusted that, you know, they didn't send him with a missionary party. He came on a ship alone to Hawaii, and went over to Kauai and became an aide to Kamuli'i and later to the missionaries, and lived there, and was a very important person in the coming of Christianity to Kauai. He's little known about him, sort of gathering information about him, and he's another great story. So in New England, there's still a treasure trove of great stories like that, and more it just builds up the, you know, the role of the Native Hawaiians in New England and when they came back here. So there's plenty more, you know. I'm hoping somebody younger picks up on this stuff. I'm getting a little old, so I keep looking for this stuff. So okay, how's that?
Oh, that's wonderful.
Between, I mean, Chris, it sounds like he was just the celebrity, and, you know, one of those people that you wanted to invite to these dinner parties in New England. I mean, almost like being paraded around as like, here is an example of what can be. I mean, between Webster, Rockwell, and it sounds like he was at some very nice dinner parties and just put forward as an example. These stories are fascinating.
You know, I think it's more of a rural story, because he lived with the Mills in Torringford, and we went there and visited. I'm really close to the kahu there at Torringford Church, Sister Rhonda, and the Torringford is a rural part of a town called Torrington, and so there was a general store there, and he'd like to go. From what I've read letters people wrote about him, and he liked to go to the general store and, you know, by the hot stove in the wintertime and talk story, you know, and witness to people. And he'd walk. Now, you know, you tell people that, you know, the like Thomas and Henry, that they'd walk 10, 20, 30, 40 miles to go see somebody. And people, they can't believe, you know, they don't believe you when you tell them that, but they did. Hopu, I think it was when Kanui came into around Long Island Sound, and he was up in Cornwall. It's pretty far. It's a pretty far walk. And he felt in his heart, he felt he needed to help this Native Hawaiian that had just landed. And he walked all the ways down from Cornwall down to the coast just to comfort another one of his Native Hawaiian friends. Yeah. So but Henry became, you know, I guess a folk hero, you might say, in America. And 1816, Samuel Mills and some other people in Litchfield put a pamphlet out about him, and they spread it all across America. So his biography that he wrote in South Canaan was distributed all across America. And so before his death, the formation of the Foreign Mission School, he was getting to be known and preaching in churches and so forth. But after his death, when the Memoirs was published, that's when he really came into the American mainstream. Now, the Missionary Herald and these other missionary magazines, secular newspapers would take the stories and republish them. So I've seen him on front pages of little papers all across America. Now, fast forward to 1860s, 1870, and Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, comes to Hawaii as a young reporter. And when he grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, he read the Memoirs of Ōpūkaha, in Sunday school class, and he said he wept over it. And so in the list of his bucket list for coming to Hawaii, right near the top was to go to the Hikiauheau and see the temple where Ōpūkaha served. And sure enough, Mark Twain visited where Ōpūkaha was, and he wrote about it in his book Roughing It. And he's sort of a joker, so he dressed up the story a little bit. But yeah, he became, so what was really great for the Hawaiian Islands was up to his time, the image of Hawaii, in the average person in New England would be Captain Cook, the death of Captain Cook, that he was killed there. And then Ōpūkahaʻia became the face of Hawaii, and he personified aloha. And I think in the churches in New England, he really turned them around somewhat through the spirit of aloha, because his take on Christianity was so original and so loving, where the people in New England are pretty straight-laced, that he really loosened things up in the churches there in a good way. Made him better people, better Christians. The people that he encountered became better Christians after they met him. So quite a significant Native Hawaiian, I'd say.
One of the things I was thinking about was what we don't see. Just like when we study the Bible, we don't know the signs of the times. You were talking about going out to do fundraising. I mean, like this is a church. This is an ecumenical organization trying to do something. How powerful was the church at that time in relationship also to government systems? Were they
okay? Well, here's what's really interesting, Kahu. Okay, the Congregational Church was the Church of New England. So you got to remember, pre-Henry's time, New England was Protestant basically. Okay, and it used to be where in the early republic, early years of America, a tithe or a tax was placed on the citizens of New England, and then that went to support the Congregational Church. So that's when you talk about separation of the church and state. Part of it was financial, and then that began to change, and so the churches had to support themselves. So and that created a new spirit in the churches, a sort of freedom where they were relying on God more than the state for their support. So when Henry and other missions candidates went out, they went out on the road to prove themselves, to prove their sincerity, that they would put the effort in to go out and get beyond their comfort zone and speak in churches to raise funds. And it was to prove that their commitment to the mission in advance. And I think this pattern still goes on in churches today, where somebody wants to be a missionary, you have to go out and many denominations, you have to go out and raise your support, have it lined up in advance. And it's a good safety thing too for somebody going overseas to have that support from the church, and you connect with people, and they become not just your financial supporters, but your friends and spiritual supporters. So that was sort of the pattern that they were establishing, and so that's sort of why the connection there. But yeah, it was at a time when the America was really changing, and so the Second Great Awakening. It was these are the I call them the sons and daughters of the Pilgrims. So this fall, September 26 is the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims landing, at the Mayflower Pilgrims landing. And we went on the Hana tour I led. We went to Plymouth Rock, which was a trip to go there with the kahus from all across the state. They were going, what are we doing here? So I said, well, here's a connection. The Thaddeus, the ship that brought the first missionaries, is called the Mayflower of the Pacific. So again, the timing of all this, when the missionaries came to Hawaii, it was the 200th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. So Henry sort of, he was like a milestone in the Pilgrim Church. It was the end of the Pilgrims, the white society. It was time now for the indigenous church to begin. And and I'm not talking just about Hawaii, but Ōpūkaha played he was a figure in the global church, in the global spread of Christianity for New England, not just Hawaii. And many of the missionaries that went to China, to Burma, Ceylon, later on Tahiti and places, they encountered Ōpūkaha either in person or through reading about him. He was a Christian example of a native Hawaiian that became a Christian, and he really has influence around the world, at the roots of many of the missions around the world. Pretty amazing, huh?
That is amazing. That, well, still his story, you know, about missions and planting the word, and look at the fruits of his labor, an entire nation converted. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, does anybody else have any other questions? I wanted to ask anybody else have questions. I don't think we have any more on the YouTube. Keiko, did you have a question?
Yeah, Chris, I think you said that one word, providential, in your presentation, and I think that just sums it up. And the short life of this young man, and you almost want to, you know, look at Christ himself, right? Christ died in his 30s, and here's Ōpūkaha dying around that age too, and to have him be the catalyst for so many to spread the gospel after his death, I think this is really providential. And for him to be connected in so many ways, like how Nani said, like being a celebrity, but when you think about his presence, perhaps inspiring the book Uncle Tom's Cabin to be written, that's one thing. And then for Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain to be inspired, having read the memoir of Henry Ōpūkaha. So, you know, so fast forward for all of us today, we as members of any of these Kalavina churches are really thankful to him for what he started, and for us as owning that responsibility to carry out his work.
Yes. Yeah, just getting back to one thing I mentioned about his role in the anti-slavery movement. There's a book there. I mean, I don't think I'm the guy to write it, but there's material there that's a really incredible. That's something, you know, one thing, you know, my following his footsteps, the one thing that popped out of me, I never expected, was the influence he had on people that had played key roles in the anti-slavery movement. So at the Beecher's house, he would go there, and they have, you know, invite him for dinner, and they loved him. And the other Topu and his other friends would come with him too, and in Litchfield, about 10 miles from Cornwall. So, and they were, it was a school called the Heathen School, excuse the use of that term, but that's what the name of it was. They spent a winter term there, and John Brown was studying in the same school as they were. So that, you know, and that might have been his first encounter with, I'm sure, with Polynesians. Yeah. So the other interesting thing too is the drawing of Ōpūkaha, you know, his portrait. You know, I believe that wasn't taken from life. That was, but what's interesting is that in the first edition, the engraving company that made it was this family called the Jocelyn's. And then later on, they tried to form a college in New Haven for African Americans, and they were attacked. Their house was stoned. They almost lost their lives trying to create opportunities for African American education. Then another 10 years later, the Amistad, you know that story, the slaves, the movies. Okay, so the Jocelyn's, the painting of Sink, the famous painting of the leader of the Amistad Rebellion, that was by Jocelyn, the man that the engraving of Ōpūkaha. That's pretty cool too. Yeah.
You know, maybe one last question.
Sure.
Okay, this is kind of a off the wall one, but
yeah.
You know, I'm hearing you talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin and all of these other things. From another perspective, and I'm just asking a question.
Yeah.
Would it be a possibility that they used Henry as, look what we did with this heathen, we Christianized them and propped them up so that they could use them as an example for their agenda to go promote themselves in other areas?
Oh yeah, for sure. He was, the American board recognized how like a marketing person, you know, in marketing the mission to Hawaii. He became, you know, it was, he became like a saintly figure, you know, and because the American board published the Missionary Herald, which was the main document where the notes from the mission were published. So that's something to look into too. How that's what I'm trying to do, is to show the human side of his life, because they have this glossy picture of him, like you said, with the American board built up. Who really was he? Okay, a couple of just little things, I find. So a student at Notre Dame sent my website an article that he found from Ohio that somebody had. That's how I found out that he stopped in Kauai on the way to China. And he talked about the editor of this paper grew up in Cornwall, and Ōpūkaha came to his high school class, and he said he had a star tattooed on the top of his hand, and gave details about this. So you realize he went through some heavy experiences back in Hawaii and at sea too. I mean, the sailors weren't, they weren't saints for sure. So he was around the sailors' world for a while, and what was the other thing I was going to think of? Yeah, some of these different accounts to see that. So I'm trying to find out who the human being was behind the image. But that's something to take into account too. I'm not saying that he was perfect, and I'm not saying that everything with the mission was perfect either. So yeah, so that'd be it would be good for somebody to investigate from that angle too. Yeah, but probably not me, because my last name's Cook too. Remember, so my son is Captain Cook, and my son's a fishing boat captain in Waimea, Kauai. And his merchant marine papers, his license, 100-ton license, says Captain Cook, Waimea, Kauai. So I guess I think God has a sense of humor too. Yes.
Well, let me see. I think I didn't get any other questions off of the chat portion. And anybody else has any other final comments? The answers for this post thing has been absolutely fascinating, Chris. I just, again, on behalf of all of us with the Bicentennial Committee, wanted to say thank you. And it's just hard to believe that it was 200 years ago, or as I say, or only 200 years ago, that this all happened. And it's just, the more we find out, the more fascinating it gets. As Keiko was saying, it works to show that God has been moving in this direction all this time. So unless you have any final do you have any final comments for us? Just thank you, because I'm so honored to have been invited to do this. It's like, this has been a mission for me for 35 years, and this is like the culmination of it. So and what else is really amazing is in August 16th, 1970, I landed in Honolulu Airport to go to the University of Hawaii. So that was 50 years ago today. I landed in Hawaii. That's pretty wild. So I think that's in God's providence. So again, thank you, and aloha to everybody. Thanks so much for it's been wonderful associating with all of you. Well, for those of you who are still on, this will be rebroadcast on. It'll be available on our YouTube station, and it will also be rebroadcast. Chris, in case any of your friends didn't get to see it, or relatives back home, it'll be rebroadcast next week Sunday at 12 o'clock on our YouTube channel. But lots of ways to find this, and thank you for putting the human perspective to Henry. And this is pretty amazing that one Hawaiian, as we all know, Hawaiians are special, but one Hawaiian way across there in the land was so influential. For those of you who, you know what, hold on a second, I'm gonna run and get his book. I forgot to show you. My bad, I should have had it. For those of you, this is Chris's new book. It's called Preparing the Way. And it's, Chris, it's fascinating. You can see my little bookmark in there, but it has beautiful illustrations. It's fully illustrated. And there's our Kawaiaha church way back when. But this picture on the cover, many of us have seen it many times, and it's just that it's fully colorized. It just makes it jump off and just brings everything back to life. So
yeah, I had to put a Kauai picture on the cover. So
oh, sorry, but that's okay. But
Yeah, it's Pila'a on Kauai, but it's a great picture. Yeah, it really embodies the, you know, what happened there. And there was a Native Hawaiian missionary on the cover there on the left. It's David Kavika Pohaku, and he was a missionary from Waimea Kauai to Waioli Kauai, and he's sort of the seat of the Church of Waioli. Yeah, and he showed up at the Pila'a with the so he was there with the William Alexander, the Haole missionary. So they were working together and doing this. Yeah, it wasn't just it appears like just a Haole missionary, but the Native Hawaiian missionary was with them. Yeah, so it's a good picture once you understand the full import of it. Yeah.
Each island has a story to share, and thank you for sharing yours and the Kauai perspective. Kauai has been represented, and again, for everyone who is still on here, the third Sunday of every month at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we will introduce a new topic and a new speaker that'll just continue to expand our knowledge of Christ arriving in the islands. So on behalf of Kawaiaha and our Bicentennial Committee, I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and aloha. Thank you.
Hey, aloha. Aloha.
Aloha, thank you.